After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So, final part of the Christmas story. We've looked at Zachariah and Elizabeth in the first week and the miraculous birth of John the Baptist, the one who came to prepare the way for Jesus' first coming. We discovered that John's parents were well on in years and they had no children, which was a great disgrace for women at that time. We also read that Zachariah and Elizabeth were both from the tribe of Levi, the priestly tribe, and it was on the occasion of Zachariah's service, when he was burning incense before the Lord in the temple, that the angel Gabriel came to him and told him that his wife would bear a son. And because Zachariah did not believe him, Zachariah was struck dumb until the circumcision of John over 9 months later. Because of this, everyone knew that John was a special child and one with a mission for God. Then we looked at Mary and Joseph with Chris and Helen, and we read the account from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, about how Mary and Joseph had to go to Bethlehem to be registered as belonging to the house of David, and how Mary was at full term in her pregnancy when they arrived there, and she had to have her baby in an animal's pen because there were no rooms available in the inn. Then we looked at the account of the shepherds with Liz. We read this also in Luke chapter 2, and Liz spoke, amongst other things, of the joy that John the Baptist brought to his parents and the joy that Jesus would bring to the world. So today we're going to look at the account of the Magi. But firstly, we must know where to find the account, and it's written in Matthew's Gospel, as we've just read. Each Gospel has its own emphasis, and the emphasis in Matthew is that he is showing us that Jesus is the Messiah, the King of all kings. Matthew is Jewish, and he presents to us Jesus as King of the Jews. And he shows us Jesus' genealogy from Abraham, the first Jew. He also shows us that Jesus is in the line of David, because David was a great Jewish king. Matthew also emphasizes what Jesus said, and that Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecy that was spoken about him hundreds of years ago, or should I say prophecies, because there wasn't just the one. So let's look at the account of the Magi. Now, to fully understand this account, we must understand why the Magi came and what the political situation was in Israel and the areas around it. So firstly, in verse 1 of chapter 2, we're told by Matthew that what happens after the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. They were still in Bethlehem. Now, to fully appreciate this account, we need to understand who the Magi were. Firstly, they were not kings. These were wise men, or Magi, who had come from the east of Jerusalem. And they had come because they'd seen a new star in the east, and they knew that this was a sign that a new king had been born. Now, how did they know this? Well, a long time before, during the captivity of Israel in 660, a man named Daniel was captured along with a lot of other royal and noble families and was taken into Babylon as a slave. And this slave, Daniel, did so well in interpreting the king's dreams by the power of God that the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, made him head of all the magicians in his kingdom. Now, these magicians were part of a hereditary priesthood that existed not only in Babylon, but also in Egypt, Syria, Persia, Media, and later the Parthian Empire. So when Nebuchadnezzar, in Daniel chapter 4, verse 9, gives him the title of Rabmag, which was the title of the chief of Nebuchadnezzar's court, to Daniel, for revealing and interpreting the dream the king had, the hereditary Magi were not happy. This event of interpretation of spiritual messages happens not just with Nebuchadnezzar, but also with his son Belshazzar, who had writing appear on the wall. I don't know if you remember that story, do you? Mene, Mene, Tekel and Parsim. Yeah. And he couldn't work out what it was, and Daniel came in and interpreted it. That's in Daniel chapter 5, verse 5. And of course, Daniel also found favor with Darius, the king of the Medes, who followed Belshazzar. Daniel was chosen above all of the hereditary Magi, and they were not happy. In fact, this is what set up the lion's den situation. You all remember that? Daniel in the lion's den? King Darius was tricked into a contract he couldn't break, and he had to throw Daniel into a den of lions. Of course, the Lord was victorious, as always, and Daniel, God's man, was not harmed. So these magicians, or Magi, were a mixture of astrologers, dream interpreters, and magicians. And some, as we have said, were very jealous of Daniel. Now I'm going to take you back even further. Do you remember way back in Exodus when Moses was trying to get Pharaoh to release the children of Israel from Egypt? And Moses was given power by God to defeat all their magicians. Well, these are the same spiritual group of royal advisors that also existed in Media, Syria, Persia, and later on in Parthia, the hereditary ones. Same group, same religions. Now, because Daniel was in charge of the Magi, he would have schooled them in the prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and possibly Ezekiel. So they would have known about the birth of the coming Messiah from these prophecies. So when the star appears in the sky, these wise men recognize it as being a sign that the new king of the Jews had been born. So they set off to find him. Daniel also taught the other Magi about a prophecy to do with a star. But the group of Magi that Daniel spoke to kept this information, and they passed it down 400 years to these Magi who recognized the star and left home to follow it. They probably came from Mesopotamia, modern-day Afghanistan, Iran area, around 800 miles away, to worship the newborn king. Okay, so let's park the Magi for a minute and let's talk about Herod. Now, Herod was not a Jew. He was an Edomite, an enemy of the Jews, and he had been put in place to rule Israel for the Romans. And not surprisingly, he wasn't popular with the Jews. And there was a lot of political unrest during his reign. And most of the time, he wasn't in Jerusalem because he was afraid he was going to be killed. He began his reign in 37 BC, and he reigned until 4 AD. And at the time of the birth of Christ, Herod was very close to his final illness. So we can see from this that Herod's reign was very insecure. Going back to the Magi, these men were also the kingmakers of the Persian Empire. They could put a king in place, they could remove a king from his throne. So when the Magi turned up at Herod's court asking, "Where is he who is born king of the Jews? For we have come to worship him," Herod gets extremely upset. We can only imagine what was going through his mind, but I think it was probably that they had come to remove him and place this new king of the Jews on his throne. Another thing that we should take account of is that even though that picture is absolutely beautiful, there were more than 3 Magi in attendance. These men entered Jerusalem in the latter days of the reign of Herod, but they were not 3 men on camels. The Magi were important men, kingmakers, and they entered Jerusalem with their own army. So no wonder Herod was upset and all Jerusalem with him. They were scared. It was a group of Persian, Parthian kingmakers who entered Jerusalem in the later days of King Herod's reign. It was conceivable that the Magi could have taken advantage of the king's lack of popularity to further their own interests with the establishment of a new dynasty, if a sufficiently strong contender could be found. So when they arrived and said, "Where is he that is born king of the Jews?" Herod sensed an implied threat, especially because there were civil problems in Rome and political problems in Parthia at the time. The Magi, likely travelling in force with an unimaginable oriental pomp and massive cavalry escort to make sure they were safe entering Roman territory, certainly alarmed Jerusalem and Herod. King of the Jews was intended as an insult. Herod was called King of the Jews, but he was not born King of the Jews. He wasn't even Jewish. As we said, he'd been put in place by Rome. They are asking for the king that was born King of the Jews and that they had come to worship him. The wise men ask, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." Then Herod says, "What time did the star appear?" The Magi had to be told where the baby was born. They'd got the general idea, but they didn't have specifics. So Herod asks his wise men, and they say, "In Bethlehem." So this great throng of people, the wise men and all their company and all their soldiers, go to Bethlehem, and the star stops over the place where Jesus is. Now notice that they're not in a stable now. The scriptures say they were in a house. They must have been able to find more suitable accommodation. And also notice that Jesus isn't a baby anymore, but it says child in the scriptures. Okay, so now just imagine this. We've all seen houses in Israel on the TV, haven't we? Small stone houses packed next to each other, built on very small streets. Now imagine a huge party of wise men, camels, Hundreds of soldiers, all their baggage and all their servants arriving at this little house. What on earth would the neighbours have thought? Then we read about the gifts. We always assume that there are 3 wise men because there are 3 gifts, but the Bible doesn't say that. What it does tell us is that the gifts are prophetic about the life of Jesus. God tells us that Jesus is the king above all kings. Frankincense tells us that Jesus will be our great high priest. And if you don't know, frankincense was part of the perfume that was put into the incense that Zechariah was sending up when he was in the temple, that they burned before the Lord as a pleasing sacrifice. So that tells us he's going to be our great high priest. And the myrrh, of course, foretells his death for us. There may have been other gifts, but these are not mentioned. What a day that must have been. I imagine the neighbours would have talked about it for months afterwards. The wise men were then warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, but to go another way home. One final thing about the wise men. It wasn't until the 3rd century AD that the wise men were referred to as kings. So when we think about this visit of them to Bethlehem, remember they were wise men, not kings. So how did they walk in the Spirit? That's been our motto for the year, hasn't it? Walking in the Spirit. What was their spiritual journey? I think that they saw the star and thought the king that was to be born would be born in a great palace. He would be rich and he would rule over Israel as King David had done. But what they learnt was that in Father God's eyes, riches do not mean anything. It doesn't mean money or wealth. Riches refers to your relationship with God. Are you rich in him and his ways and are not tempted by the world? Or does what matter to you amount to material things? The wise men learnt that Jesus was born into a humble family with nothing to make them special except their love for God and his ways. These are the kind of people that God entrusts his Son with. These are the kind of people that God trusts with his Spirit.